Abjection is the act of casting down that which is vile or unworthy. It gained prominence when the term was adopted by Julia Kristeva to outline her theory of subject formation, different from Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalysis. Her model of subjectivity proposes that for an independent and cogent speaking subject to be born, the infant's bodily and psychic attachments to his or her maternal origins must be successfully and violently objected. Throughout life, all objections are reenactments of this primary matricide. In Revolting Subjects, Imogen Tyler adds a much needed social to this term. Whatever the psychological origin of objection, the way it is enacted, and who are seen as abjects, is always contingent upon the historical, cultural, and political situation. The book takes a cultural political economy approach to evaluate neoliberalism, meaning it is concerned with not only how a neoliberal culture imaginary provides a semiotic frame for constructing the world, but also how such an imaginary actively contributes to its construction. If this sounds a bit confusing, let's turn to the popular Channel 4 documentary series Benefit Street for an example. In this fictionalised, highly accurate depiction of living on welfare, we are presented with an underclass, a group of scroungers who will do anything including having abnormally large families to get handouts and avoid work. Couple 2014's Benefit Street, with continued sensationalist anti-welfare headlines in the tabloid press, many working and middle-class citizens have started to see government as too soft, calling MPs to crack down on layabouts. Politicians have seized this consensus to impose tougher austerity measures. This may include changes in legislation such as the introduction of universal credit, or contracting private companies to means test the poor and disabled, forcing any of the feckless into workfare schemes. By saying a semiotic frame actively contributes to the continuation of neoliberal capitalism, Tyler uncovers how the media situate abject bodies, in this case the underclass, as national abjects, depicting scroungers as selfishly hoarding benefits to fund their carefree life while the rest of us pay for it, working in an increasingly competitive, stressful job market. In reality, most people in poverty today are employed, and there is only an infinitesimal amount of government funding lost on benefit fraud or used on larger families. The anti-welfare ideology hides reality. Austerity isn't caused by the successive funding of the underclass, but is a consequence of the 2008 financial crash. And let's remind ourselves, this bank bailout was the largest of free government handouts. Having covered a basic example of social objection, in the remainder of this video essay I will use two science fiction films, Neil Blomkamp's Elysium and John Carpenter's They Live, to further explain the existence of objection in neoliberal society. On a side note, I use science fiction as its speculative essence is able to incorporate contemporary issues of inequality and amplify these to a grand scale, making highly visible, actually existing political topics. Popular culture is a product of its environment. Social objection remains rife in our neoliberal society, so how then is it represented in Elysium? Elysium reveals an Earth was a destitute environment, corporate-governed politics, and an urban population crammed into poor-quality infrastructure. The super-rich inhabit an off-planet luxury space site called Elysium. Many of LA's ethnically diverse urbanites pay smugglers huge amounts of money to be taken to this white haven, where there lies the chance of advanced healthcare. If they are not stopped before Earth, they are instantly captured on Elysium. Private company security robots then transport them to detention facilities. A common theme in Elysium and Blomkamp's prior film, District 9, is refugee issues. This endless struggle of the earthbound subjects to secure a stable life in Elysium is redolent of today's continued migrant crisis, and Tyler's argument that over the last 40 years citizenship has been an exclusively device of state racism. This can be seen during the new Labour government when the rights of refugees were repressed. More and more the term asylum seeker, through government legislation and media awareness, took centre stage. In response to the influx of migration in the early 2000s from the Middle East, the media helped generate a moral panic that many of these so-called refugees were actually bogus, wanting to take welfare, council houses, and being health tourists, clog up the NHS, whilst also importing their incompatible, terrorist-breeding Islamic culture. Tyler argues state racism meant asylum seekers being marked as non-citizens. They became hyper-visible as national abjects. Law and order politicians stepped in to distill the crisis, contracting private companies to run detention facilities. Ensuring the non-status of asylum seekers meant they were barred from paid work, whilst also preventing the admission of any state support. Britain became a hostile environment where hate speech could survive, and asylum seekers lived under constant insecurity, interpolated as not wanted, impure, foreign bodies. The robots outsourced by the Elysium government to run detention centres registers with the UK and Western countries' privately contracted detention facilities. G4S and Serco are key figures in making an extra book of socially objective bodies. In America, there is even a right-wing think tank disguised as a charity called ALEC, which allows state legislators to accept corporate donations and be invited to exuberant weekends with business leaders, including prison and detention contractors. These legislators draft and pass tougher border policies, which ensures more asylum seekers get detained and continued contractor profit. The violent nature in which Elysian robots treat humans is mirrored in multiple allegations of physical abuse levelled against detention facilities. Even the British facilities, which try to detain humanely, have a hidden exploitative level. For example, in many detention centres, occupants are allowed to complete menial tasks for indoor points. This means contractors no longer need to employ janitors and cleaners, which raises their profits. Remember, this denial of a minimum wage to detainees by EU standards should constitute a form of forced labour. Another example is Bernardo's Children's Charity, who provided third-party services when setting up a new, family-friendly detention centre. However, pro-migrant or child charities run the risk of losing their critical stance. There is no family-friendly or humane detention. Its very enactment can disrupt a child's functions and a mother's emotional state. Thus, even when detention isn't as violent as that depicted by Elysium's robots, it is still a damaging process of social objection. I now want to turn to John Carpenter's They Live as an allegory for the agency that socially abject people have. Another of Tyler's key departures from Kristeva's psychoanalytic theory is to understand what it means to be abject, seen in Revolting Subjects as she analyses multiple acts of resistance. In They Live, LA is being run by a group of alien yuppies brainwashing the population into conformity. Our key scene is when Roddy Piper, the film's protagonist, wears glasses which reveals the ideology of the aliens. Today, anti-border or anti-capitalist struggles, metaphorically speaking, wear these glasses, as they are the ones who see the system and think of alternatives. For example, Tyler's description of female asylum seekers' naked protest at Yarlswood Detention Centre is one of just many acts of migrant resistance to gain media attention. Tyler links this with what Agamben calls bare life, that is, refugees have no status in the sovereign political body, so are dehumanised. Would the Yarlswood protests, the act of getting naked, reinforce the notion of bare life? If the British state is willing to treat human subjects like animals, appearing naked reminds others that all women share the symbol of motherhood and power of life, thus are deserving of respect. The protests oppose the demonisation of migrants and passive sentimentalisation, instead positioning migrants as having a cultural history and an agency, who can question regimes of state racism and the legitimacy of border controls throughout the world. Another example is Occupy Wall Street, which was a result of and sparked many more anti-capitalist protesting, contesting global neoliberalism which places profit over people. Right-wing critics described Occupy as a disorganised bunch of hippies without demands. First, they weren't disorganised, creating networks with a variety of social movements, and second, the lack of a clear manifesto was necessary. Slavoj Žižek argues that any set of demands could have been appropriated, watered down by neoliberal politicians, and distill revolutionary change. Occupy was an affirmative statement that dismissed capitalism as being the only viable economic system.
Remember that our basic message is we are allowed to think about alternatives. We are allowed to think about alternatives. The taboo is broken. The taboo is broken. We do not live in the best possible world.
Unfortunately, the last few years has seen a growth of the far right in Europe and America. There is what Tyler calls a liberal paradox in order, as big business and conservatives feed off anti-migrant sentiment. The far right gain votes from worried white workers who, instead of questioning outsourcing or unredistributive company policies, place blame on low-wage migrants for stealing their jobs. When hearing about racial division or violent events, it is easy to become pessimistic, but focusing on acts of political resistance from the socially objected, like Yarlswood and Occupy, spark optimism. People are beginning to put on their glasses, see through neoliberal ideology, and are wanting to create a new way of organising social life at an international scale. A world where politicians can't exploit refugees fleeing from conflicts started by neocolonialism, like Afghanistan, or capitalism, like the militia wars in the Congo. A world which questions the need for borders, one which doesn't support vast economic inequality through corporate tax avoidance, and one where the harmful effects of social abjection no longer exist.